Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to What Are You Painting Now? And we're going to be doing something completely different. We're going to be taking a look at the Genestealers and the Genestealer cult. And we're going to be taking a look at quite a bit with the Genestealers over this week. We're going to be taking a look at the Genestealers in-game history. We're going to be taking a look at their biology. We're going to be taking a look at their rules in the game and how to use them currently. But today, we're going to be taking a look at the history of the Genestealers and how they evolved, if you would pardon the pun, in our universe, because I find it really interesting and because I think that it mirrors how the company evolved a lot. And I've been doing a bit of research here and there, just a bit, but I want to take a look at what they were and what they turned into. So let's get right to it. So this right here is the original Genestealer. It's very different from what we know it to be today. So it started out in a game called Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, which is a very different game to the one we know today. It's more akin to D&D than it is to Warhammer 40,000 as we know it today. And D&D is a role-playing game, and Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader was essentially Warhammer, which was another D&D clone, put into space at that time. It was D&D clone at that time. I should stipulate that. And so the Genestealer doesn't owe its origins to sci-fi, but rather fantasy tropes, like a lot of the original 40k characters did. Like the Eldar are just space elves, and there were space dwarves, and so on and so on. And so the Genestealers were just space vampires. So rather than sucking blood and transforming people through magic and growing their cult and their empire, they were essentially vampires in space. So, our buddy here went from the space vampire in Rogue Trader, released in 1987, to something fairly different. In fact, much closer to the one we know today in 1989 with the introduction of Space Hulk. Now, Space Hulk took a very different take on the Genestealer, and it was very much inspired by aliens. So they took this guy, and instead of having him being something that collected people's genes and slowly changed them, they took that concept and they brought it to be something like this. A creature which is well adapted for getting through those crawl spaces. But instead of versing the underprepared and under-armored Ripley, they were versing the very much prepared Space Marine Terminators. So, they transformed from the Rogue Trader version we know during Space Hulk during 1989. During 1990, we saw some additional releases, one being the Deathwing expansion, which was essentially the Dark Angel version of the same game, and then Genestealer in the same year, which is ironically the only Space Hulk game where you don't verse Genestealers. You in fact verse the Genestealer cult. And this was the first appearance of the Genestealer cult in a major way. They did have a release during the White Dwarf launch of the Genestealers and all of that, but it's not quite as major as it is in the Space Hulk, which kind of legitimized them in a way. So, in 1993, we see the introduction of Warhammer 40,000, the second edition. And this is really where we see the start of Warhammer 40,000. It completely changes how things are. Instead of being a role-playing game, it's a skirmish-based game, but it's much more chaotic than the current version of Warhammer 40,000 that we know. Now, the models themselves didn't do as much evolution as the game did, though we'll see that the Genestealers evolved as the games did. So what happened was, during the release of Warhammer 40,000, which is just not Rogue Trader or anything else, but the first edition, which is second edition. I know some of the times it's hard to keep track of. That's when we got the Tyranid Codex. And then Tyranids and Genestealers were fairly inseparable. There was a section in the book for the Genestealer cult, and they were very much tied together. But I'm going to go over how the rules have evolved at the very end of this. We're going to be taking a look at the models now. So we never got a model for that original Genestealer we saw. These are some of the first models we saw. So take a good long look at that Genestealer on that sprue. And I'm going to bring up a picture which I took of every version of Genestealer I could get my grubby little hands on. Now, this guy right here on the left, and we're going left to right in orders of generation, that was one I picked up when I was a kid. And the thing is, he is not that much different from the 1990 Space Hulk release. In fact, they had very, very few changes throughout the years. So, after that, during 1996, we had the introduction of another Space Hulk, the second edition, and that, I believe, is where we first see the model next along. The Genestealers get a bit of an update just before the release of their codex in 2001, and they get the ability to add scything talons to their current mix. However, so that's when the third one came along. We don't see as much of a major update for quite some time. So between this one, the one on the very left, and the one on the very right, that represents a 26-year difference. And between the one on the far right and the one left of him, that represents a 16-year or so difference. So these guys don't get released that often, and I think that that's fine because their sculpts have really stood the test of time. And what I really like about these new Genestealers is they have got a lot more aspects of the older ones, in my opinion. If you take a look at the flexible bridges or membrane or whatever it is exactly in the center of the carapace, that is much more reminiscent of the original Genestealer model than it is of any of its generations in between. So, the biggest change for the Genestealer in terms of miniatures was the introduction of the Broodlord. And that came about in 2005. And we got this bad boy. So, the Broodlord was quite an interesting model and fairly well received at the time. However, it quickly, quickly became overshadowed by all of its plastic incarnations, which I've got a collection of all of them here. So the first one to overshadow it was the Space Hulk one, which was released in 2009, which you see on your far left. And it's of a similar size to the original Broodlord in terms of height and definitely the width. The other one is slightly larger because it's got its arms outstretched and such. But this sculpt was very, very well received. However, it was really this model, the second one along. I do believe he's called the Spawn of Cyprus, which came from the Deathstorm box set release, which was the Blood Angel one. And people picked this up left, right, and center, and you really didn't see a lot of the original Broodlord. And the reason for that is not only is this guy plastic, but the original Broodlord originally came out as a metal, and people have different feelings about metal. My feeling is that it's not as easy to work with as plastic, and I find it slightly frustrating, especially if when they're falling down on the tabletop, they become very upsetting. So there's that. But he became updated into Finecast, and that is a whole other mess which people became upset about. And then finally we have the 2006 release, and he's not actually a Broodlord, but a Patriarch, which is something completely different. But they seem to have, in the current lore, seem to have mixed them together in a way. Now, we'll move on and we'll take a look at the Genestealer cult. Now, the Genestealer cult was originally released in 1989. This is when, just a year before we got plastic versions of these guys in the box set release of Genestealer, which is the Space Hulk expansion. There were no plastic releases of the special characters such as the Patriarch and such, but there were plastic releases of the hybrids. And we wouldn't see any updates to this line for another 17 years, which is, of course, our current Deathwatch Overkill models. So that's a long time to linger in obscurity. And to round this out, I'm going to talk about the evolution of the Genestealer in their rules. So I'm just going to leave you with this beautiful picture, and I'm going to go over their rules a bit. So originally, the Genestealers were a fairly well-costed model in the original game. And when I speak about the original game, I mean Warhammer 40,000 2nd edition. In this version of the game, they were a unit that was, in my opinion, specifically designed to take on the Space Marines in hand-to-hand combat. These guys were complete monsters with 4 attacks, and they had a strength of 6. They could tear through armor like nobody's business because strength reduced armor, much like Warhammer back in the day, and they were just very, very effective. The Genestealer cult, as I mentioned, were released with the original Tyranid Codex, and these people were meant to be allies of theirs. At this point in time, it seemed like the Genestealer cult were going to stay around forever. However, once things started getting updated, things looked very different. The next Tyranid update was in 1998, and the Genestealers were no longer the center stage of the Tyranid swarm. In fact, they had taken a major step back. The Carnifex and the Gaunts and the more flexible genuses of the Tyrannid swarm had taken center stage. The Tyranids had some interesting fluff pieces, and they had a dramatic reduction in their ability. Though there was already a reduction in the ability through some other means, the Codex took them from the Strength 6, as I mentioned, down to Strength 4, and that's where they remained. And they took them from the 4 attacks down to 2. And this is pretty much the stat block that they've kept from now on. These guys were considerably nerfed. And I think the reason for that is the Genestealer no longer took the central stage, which they once did. Excuse me, I got something in my throat. So, what happened was, as things went on, the company realized that they needed to take a new approach with the Genestealers. And instead of going, alright, we'll make them more powerful and stuff, we had the introduction of the Yumgrel Genestealers, which was a callback to the original Genestealer which we saw, because that is where they originally came from, the moons of Yumgrel. However, when the Tyranids released their new codex in 2005, this is when we saw the major update for the actual Genestealers, the introduction of the Broodlord. And he was alright, but I do believe the main reason that Genestealers were fine at this stage of the game is, if I remember correctly, infiltrating and assaulting on the first turn was something that people could still do. So as the game moves on and evolves, we see how the Genestealers change and evolve. That's why their strength came down, because their strength was largely because it reduced people's armor saves. And now today, we see the Genestealers with rending, which is meant to represent that ability to get through any armor. So, after this, the Genestealers remained relatively stable this entire time from then on out. And mostly the reason that they've reduced in power is due to not themselves and their stat block, but due to how the game has changed. And that is something that I find very interesting. Well guys, I hope that you have found this video of some interest, going over the real world history of the Genestealer and the Genestealer cult. Next up, we're going to be talking about Genestealer biology. I hope to see you there.